The Final Fantasy series has been on a hot streak lately, and is arguably in the best place it's been in decades. With Final Fantasy XVI, a game I absolutely loved, launching last year to overwhelmingly positive reviews, Final Fantasy XIV continuing to be one of the most beloved and popular MMOs on the market, and the remarkable Final Fantasy VII Remake, a game I was utterly enamoured with, that quickly earned its place among my favourite games of the decade so far, dropping just a few years back in 2020. So I've spent the past few years eagerly anticipating Rebirth, theorising about where the story could go next, and fantasising about how Square Enix would rework the many memorable locations and story beats we knew would inevitably be found in Rebirth. Needless to say, Rebirth was handily my most anticipated game of 2024, and I went in fully expecting Rebirth to be something special, so it was Square's game to lose. But I'm happy to report that Rebirth surpassed my lofty expectations in every conceivable way. Rebirth improves upon the already excellent combat system of Remake, offers a baffling amount of content that will leave you constantly questioning how the hell Creative Business Unit 1 developed Rebirth in just 4 years, and takes the story of Final Fantasy VII to new heights, cementing this ensemble of characters as my favourite video game cast of all time. Before I fully dive into my review of Rebirth, I want to give a quick spoiler warning, similar to the one I gave in my review of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, because while this video will not feature any major story spoilers for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, as I'll only talk in depth about story beats found in the trailers and demo, there will be full spoilers for both Final Fantasy VII Remake and Crisis Core, as I can't even talk about what Square Enix is setting out to do with the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy without spoiling Remake, and I think it would hamstring this review if I tried to dance around spoilers for Remake and Crisis Core. So if you're yet to play those games, you might want to duck out for now, and come back once you've finished them. Unless you're one of those monsters who doesn't care about spoilers. After finishing Final Fantasy VII Remake, it was clear that this remake trilogy is far from a one-to-one retelling of Final Fantasy VII. It's more accurate to say that it's somewhere between a remake that massively expands on the story and characters, and a sequel to the original Final Fantasy VII. While you could technically jump straight into Remake without playing the original version of Final Fantasy VII, you would end up missing out on a lot of context, as Remake and Rebirth rely on you knowing the events of the original FF7, as they play with your preconceived expectations of Final Fantasy VII's story, and deviate from it in key ways, making it clear that there's some alternate timeline or multiverse shenanigans at play, as aspects of the Final Fantasy VII timeline are seemingly being rewritten before our eyes. And just like Remake, the further into Rebirth you get, the weirder things get. But now that the cat's out of the bag, Square Enix doesn't hesitate to mess with you from the jump. Rebirth's baffling prologue alone will leave you questioning what the hell is going on if you're familiar with the original story of Final Fantasy VII, but I won't spoil why that is, because Square Enix gave us the courtesy of leaving this mind-melting moment out of the demo, preserving it for our first time playing Rebirth. I will say, my read on what exactly is happening in this trilogy has changed after finishing Rebirth, but of course I'll leave my thoughts and theories out to avoid spoiling anything. It's worth noting that Square Enix said you could jump right into Rebirth first, but make no mistake, that is objectively untrue, and is just nonsense marketing speak to try and sell more copies. Rebirth is the middle part of a trilogy, which means you'll have no idea what's going on if you jump in here without playing Remake. The more you put into these games, the more you'll get out of them. While you can definitely play the original FF7, then the Remake trilogy, and understand the story perfectly well, if you've explored the greater Final Fantasy VII universe by playing Crisis Core and watching Advent Children, these games will reward your dedication. Even the Yuffie DLC for Remake connects to Dirge of Cerberus, the PS2 shooter starring Vincent Valentine, so its clear Creative Business Unit 1 is dedicated to highlighting and celebrating every part of the Final Fantasy VII universe, good and bad. Picking up after Remake's explosive ending, Rebirth sees the crew of Cloud, Tifa, Aerith, Barret and Red 13 now out of Midgar and in the greater world of Gaia. Throughout Rebirth, the crew covers a staggering amount of ground as they travel from town to town in pursuit of Sephiroth. Final Fantasy VII's story is filled with intrigue and exciting, memorable moments, but it's always been the characters that carried this story for me. The other day, I saw someone raise the question, does Final Fantasy VII have the best lineup of characters in gaming? And the more I marinated on this thought, the more I realised I couldn't refute it. As far as I'm concerned, Final Fantasy VII, especially the Remake series, does have the best ensemble of characters in any game. I truly like every member of the party in Rebirth. There's not a single character who stands out as underbaked or forgettable. This cast is special. There's a reason these characters resonate with people and have remained beloved and iconic for almost 30 years to a degree that no other Final Fantasy cast has. Cloud is among the most recognisable video game protagonists of all time. Aerith's kind demeanour makes her instantly endearing. Tifa is one of the most charming characters to ever grace a Final Fantasy game, and Barret has so much more depth than you might expect at first glance due to his exaggerated personality. We knew that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's core circle of characters would be notably bigger than Remake's due to the addition of characters like Vampire Vincent Valentine, Pilot Cid, Wutai Ninja Yuffie, who becomes a fully fledged member of the team here following her debut in Remake's Episode Intermission DLC, and of course I can't forget about our beloved Scottish cat, Kate Sith. And yes, that is how they pronounce his name in Rebirth, so hopefully we can put the debate over the pronunciation of his name to rest once and for all. Kate Sith is a beautiful encapsulation of what makes Rebirth so wonderful. Rebirth is entirely unashamed of its absurdity. Kate Sith is a robotic cat with a thick Scottish accent who rides around atop a massive robot Moogle, handing out fortunes. But not once does he feel out of place, and nobody in the party even bats an eye when he's introduced. Yes, this character is utterly ridiculous, but in this world, people are so used to seeing crazy shit that Kate Sith doesn't even register as out of the ordinary for them. Despite having a lot of characters to juggle, Rebirth manages to give every party member their moments in the spotlight, developing and giving additional depth to the returning cast members, and immediately showing you why you should care about the newcomers. While Remake introduced us to these new iterations of Barret, Red 13 and Tifa, Rebirth is the game that takes the time to explore each of their backstories and motivations, as we visit the hometowns of these three throughout Rebirth's globe-spanning story. Barret and Red 13's backstories hit home especially hard in Rebirth. As I said before, Barret is a character with so much more complexity and texture than you might expect at first glance. Rebirth dives into Barret's tragic history as we learn what sparked his passionate hatred for Shinra that led to his transformation from a miner living a simple life in a small town to the leader of Avalanche, the group of eco-warriors determined to strike down Shinra by any means necessary. The characterization of Red 13 is similarly superb. The way they slowly drop the veil around this character as he lets his guard down and starts to reveal his true self is phenomenal. Without spoiling anything, at a certain point, Red 13's personality and characterization starts to shift, and one of the ways they showcase this is one of the best and most direct expressions of character growth I've ever seen in a game. Red's voice actor Max Middleman deserves massive commendation, as this role requires a lot out of him, but he more than meets these requirements. If Max doesn't get a nomination for Best Actor at the Game Awards, it'll be a catastrophic snub. I truly felt for Red 13 and Barrett in Rebirth, but while these two are the standouts for me in Rebirth's story, that's not to say that the rest of the party members aren't given plenty of heartfelt moments. There are scenes in Rebirth where just about every member of the crew pours their heart out to someone around them, and these moments showcase how all-around well-written Rebirth's characters are, and how magnificent the casting for each of these characters is, with Square managing to find the perfect actor to fill each role. Characters like Yuffie and Vincent get to play more significant roles in Rebirth than their prior iterations, as unlike the original Final Fantasy VII, where these two were optional characters that you could miss entirely, they're integrated into the core story here, which was an expected, but nevertheless excellent decision. I also don't think it's a spoiler to say that fan favourite Zack Fair plays a different, more significant role in Rebirth than he did in the original Final Fantasy VII. I mean, he's on the cover for Christ's sake. And as a long-time Crisis Core fan, I was thrilled to see Zack treated with the respect and reverence he deserves. I love the original Final Fantasy VII as much as the next JRPG fan, but Remake and Rebirth have given this entire cast infinitely more depth than I could have ever expected. The character work in these games is nothing short of amazing. One of the main reasons the Final Fantasy VII cast feels more developed here than ever before is because Rebirth allows you to spend additional time with these characters through side missions and optional conversations where you'll make timed dialogue choices that affect your relationship with each party member. These choices make tiny changes to the story, like determining which character Cloud will go on a date with at the Gold Saucer, which I am a little disappointed to say was Aerith for me. Don't get me wrong, Aerith is great, but deep down, we all know that the best girl of Final Fantasy VII is Tifa. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's extraordinary character work extends far beyond our core group of heroes, and one of Rebirth's greatest strengths is its villains, and the variety offered by heavily featuring three distinct, yet equally compelling sets of antagonists. You have the legion of corporate scumbags that make up Shinra's executives, characters like Shinra President Rufus and the snide Scarlet, who you just love to hate. The personalities of these executives are very heightened, so you could see these characters being too ridiculous to the point of being annoying. Especially someone like the cackling evil scientist Hojo, who is such a cartoonishly evil, moustache-twirling villain. And yet it works, because Rebirth leans into the silliness, and the actor playing Hojo commits so hard to the part. Then you have the Turks, the crew on the ground doing Shinra's dirty work, several of whom we came across in the first game, like Sung and Rude, though the Turks also have a major newcomer in Rebirth with the stern, yet unfortunately klutzy Elena, who I know FF7 fans were excited to see debut in Rebirth. Then of course, there are the big dogs, Sephiroth and Jenova. Rebirth does a fantastic job of making Sephiroth feel genuinely menacing. Sephiroth almost feels like this force of nature that just shows up from time to time to wreak havoc. A huge part of Sephiroth's chilling aura is owed to Tyler Hoechlin's incredible performance. It's a huge testament to the range of Tyler Hoechlin that he can convincingly play Superman in Superman and Lois and have his performance radiate positivity, hope and kindness, but also play Sephiroth, one of the most iconic and sinister villains in the history of games, equally convincingly. Sephiroth feels more imposing than ever in Rebirth, thanks in no small part to the fact that we get to control him directly during the Nibelheim flashback at the start of the game, which Square released as a demo. While playing as Sephiroth, you realise just how fast and powerful he is, with his skills easily eclipsing the capabilities of everyone else we've controlled up to this point. In many ways, Final Fantasy VII has always been ahead of its time, but nowhere is this more true than with VII's strong environmentalist message, which feels more prescient today than ever. Thanks to current-gen graphics, Rebirth can drive its message home in a way that simply wasn't possible on the PS1. While Rebirth is filled with beautiful locations, like the exotic beaches of resort town Costa del Sol and the sprawling green fields of the grasslands, this is also a dying world that's been abused and drained of all its resources by corporate greed. And there are certainly times when this is apparent in Rebirth, as you get further into your journey and see how desolate parts of this world have become. Something I love about Rebirth is that despite exploring these serious themes, and including some very dark moments, it never loses its sense of whimsy. There's a consistent spirit of adventure and fun that persists throughout Rebirth. I'd even say that Rebirth is a little lighter than Remake. For every powerful, emotionally resonant moment, like a character reminiscing on the loss of a loved one, there's always an equally impactful comedic beat, like stumbling across the bold-only bar that Rude visits to unwind after a hard day of Turk business. Even the sheer presence of characters like Kate Sith and Yuffie heightens the silliness in Rebirth. But the two tones of Rebirth never feel at odds with one another. Largely because despite being filled with comedic beats, Rebirth never undercuts a poignant moment for a cheap joke. As I mentioned at the start, this is a spoiler-free review, so I won't mention any specifics, but I'd be remiss to not touch on my feelings about Rebirth's ending. Just like the ending of Remake, the ending of Rebirth is going to be contentious. Personally, I liked the ending of Remake, so I guess it'll be somewhat unsurprising to hear that I liked Rebirth's ending too. But with that being said, Rebirth's final chapters are undeniably a bit messy. The way Rebirth brings together all the disparate elements of its story at the very end does feel inelegant. So I completely understand why it won't work for some players. But for me, this doesn't take away from the fact that as a long-time Final Fantasy VII fan, the final hours of Rebirth are filled with exciting moments that had me wide-eyed and slack-jawed, completely losing my mind. I think there were a good 30 minutes in Rebirth's final chapter where I just about forgot to blink because I was so enraptured with what was happening on screen. While Midgar is inarguably the most iconic location in Final Fantasy VII, and its iconography and skyline are likely the first thing that come to mind when you picture Final Fantasy VII, the portion of 7 covered in Rebirth is also home to more than a few iconic locations of its own, be it the Grasslands, Costa del Sol, Cosmo Canyon, Nibelheim, or of course, the Gold Saucer. Our party covers a lot of ground in Rebirth, and you can feel that as you play. By the end of Rebirth, I felt like I'd been on a grand adventure with these characters, and traversed a huge swath of the world in search of Sephiroth. Arguably the greatest strength of Final Fantasy VII Remake was its stellar combat mechanics that masterfully blended the best aspects of several Final Fantasy battle systems. Remake's combat system took aspects of the original Final Fantasy VII, reworking the ATB system into the ATB gauge that fills as you fight to provide the energy required to perform skills, cast spells, and use items, and then combined this idea with the real-time hack-and-slash action of 15, and the emphasis on staggering enemies from Final Fantasy XIII. It then married all of these ideas together to create something that felt new and innovative. Needless to say, FF7 Remake had laid a solid groundwork for Rebirth's combat system to build off of. Rebirth keeps many of Remake's mechanics intact, slashing away at monsters with Cloud's Buster Sword, or pummeling your way through a group of Shinra goons as Tifa feels just as good here as it did in Remake, but Rebirth also features countless additions and tweaks that make combat feel better in nearly every conceivable way. The most noticeably improved area of Rebirth's battles is the aerial combat. Fighting flying enemies in Remake could be a bit cumbersome, but in Rebirth, it's not only easier to have Cloud launch himself to flying enemies to continue combos in mid-air, but thanks to the new team-up abilities, Cloud can also use his Buster Sword to launch Tifa into the air in an instant, making her a far more versatile fighter than she was before. The other reason fighting flying enemies is a smoother experience this time around is because Cloud has been given a ranged attack in Rebirth. If you hit square immediately after dodging, Cloud will send a burst of energy from his sword, which makes it a breeze to clear out weak flying enemies, and send the strong ones plummeting to the ground, where they're much easier to deal with. These changes make fighting flying enemies in Rebirth a far more frictionless experience than it was in Remake. Just like Remake, Rebirth allows you to pull up a menu mid-battle to utilise different abilities, spells, items and summons, and doing so will slow time to a crawl while you make your selection. This is a perfect compromise that allows Rebirth and Remake to make the switch to real-time action-heavy combat, while still keeping a hint of Final Fantasy VII's turn-based DNA in there. However, if you don't want to navigate menus mid-battle, you can also freely map abilities and items to quick-use slots, allowing you to use them without losing the momentum of a fight. Rebirth's combat encounters have a satisfying loop to them. In nearly every battle, your goal is ultimately to stagger your opponent, leaving them in a vulnerable state where you can deal massive amounts of damage to them. To do this, you'll have to fill an enemy's stagger bar, something you can do much faster if you exploit an opponent's weakness to pressure them. Each enemy type has a different criteria for pressuring them. For some enemies, it's an elemental weakness that can be triggered by a spell. For others, it's dodging a specific attack, causing your enemy to violently plunge to the ground. And for certain enemies, simply sustaining enough damage will put them in their pressured state. Much like a Persona game, the fastest way to learn an enemy's weakness is to cast the Assess spell on them, which brings up their profile with a list of strengths and weaknesses. Of course, you can play as various party members in Rebirth, and each of them feels drastically different to control. As you probably remember if you played Remake, Cloud is a great all-rounder. Tifa is your close-range fighter who batters foes with lightning-fast flurries of punches. Barret is your ranged attacker who's always peppering enemies with a continuous stream of bullets from the sidelines, and Aerith similarly stays out of the way, flinging spells from a distance, while also utilising a plethora of abilities to buff and heal her allies. But in Rebirth, we also have a few more party members to play as, which adds a massive amount of variety to Rebirth's combat encounters. There's Yuffie, who we first got to play as in Remake's episode Intermission DLC. Yuffie was easily my second most played character after Cloud. She is so fun to play as. She's fast and kinetic, bouncing around environments, flinging her giant shuriken at foes, then casting a range of elemental ninjutsu. Then you have Red 13, who was introduced in the tail end of Remake, but wasn't playable until now. Red is another close-range fighter who's incredibly nimble, flipping around the battlefield, going from enemy to enemy with his seamless combos. And of course, we also have our favourite robotic cat, Cait Sith, who's the most unconventional character to control. Cait fights with a megaphone that he can wallop enemies with at close range, or blast them with magical music notes with from a distance. He has a range of strange abilities, like his Roll of the Dice skill, that sees him roll dice that will determine what effect his attack has on an enemy. And if you need his attack to pack a little more punch, Cait can summon, then ride atop his massive robotic Moogle. Each party member in Rebirth also has a unique ability mapped to triangle. Cloud can switch between his speedy operator stance and his more tanky Punisher stance. Tifa has a powerful strike that can be chained into combos. Aerith has a teleportation ability that can get her out of the way of danger in an instant. Barrett can fire a powerful burst of energy from his gun arm. Red 13 has his Vengeance mode, which when active increases his damage output and speed, and also gives him access to the Siphon Fang ability, which allows him to drain HP from enemies. Kate Sith has his Kitty Wallop attack, where he leaps in the air and repeatedly slams the foe in the head with his megaphone, and Yuffie can fling her shuriken, and if you press the attack button once her shuriken has been thrown, she'll cast a barrage of elemental ninjutsu. What never ceased to amaze me about Rebirth is that it offers 7 playable characters, and every one of them not only feels distinct, but fantastic to play as. Of course I had my favourites in Cloud, Tifa and Yuffie, but there wasn't a single character I didn't enjoy playing as. There are countless moments throughout Rebirth where you're forced to play as a specific party member, and there was no character I dreaded playing as. Each party member in Rebirth is more interesting to control than 90% of protagonists in other games. I'm more excited now than ever to find out how Vincent will play in Part 3. Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat was already pretty damn stylish, but Rebirth brings a new level of panache to its fights through the newly added synergy attacks. When party members use their ATB gauge in fights, they'll fill up a secondary synergy gauge, and when 2 compatible party members have sufficiently charged their synergy gauges, they can perform a powerful team-up technique. Synergy attacks are such a fun addition in Rebirth, and the over-the-top animations that accompany them are a joy to behold. Seeing Aerith throw on a pair of sunglasses to match Barrett before the two of them pummel enemies with a barrage of attacks was always a delight. Learning new battle skills works very differently in Rebirth than in other RPGs. While you still learn certain abilities like synergy attacks and team-up attacks through a traditional skill tree, your abilities are largely derived from your weapons. Each party member gets a series of new weapons throughout Rebirth, with each weapon having a unique weapon ability tied to it. If you use that weapon ability enough, the character will master it, allowing them to use it even when they don't have that weapon equipped. Because of this, your list of skills is constantly expanding in Rebirth, which ensures fights remain interesting throughout Rebirth's meaty runtime. Once you start finding ways to combine these weapon abilities, they can completely change the way you use a character, so you'll want to master the ability of each new weapon you come across ASAP. One of my favourite examples of this is using Yuffie's doppelganger ability, which allows her to summon a clone of herself that mirrors her movements, then pairing it with her elemental ninjutsu ability that lets her change the elemental damage type of her ninjutsu. Once I started leaning on this combo that let me hammer enemies with 2 continuous streams of elemental ninjutsu, I was staggering even the most fearsome of foes in a matter of seconds. Once a fight has drawn on long enough, you can call forth a summon. Just like spells, summons come in the form of orbs of materia that can be equipped by any party member, usually requiring multiple notches of your ATB gauge to be brought forth. Creative Business Unit 1 has perfected the art of summoning animations. Rebirth's summoning animations are long and intricate enough that you feel the spectacle and impact of bringing one of these powerful beings onto the battlefield, but they're also far more restrained than the overly long and flashy animations of the original Final Fantasy VII, many of which were so drawn out that you inevitably got tired of sitting through them after the first couple of times using a summon. One of the main reasons Rebirth was able to keep combat engaging throughout the 100 hours I spent with it is due to the inclusion of a staggering amount of enemy types. There's got to be a couple hundred different enemy types in Rebirth, so each new region you explore always comes with a new assortment of monsters to discover. Sure, a few do feel like palette swaps, but there's still a remarkable amount of distinct enemies in Rebirth, certainly more than you'd see in most other JRPGs. Coming off of both Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy XVI, two games with some of the most memorable boss fights in recent memory, Rebirth's boss battles were one of the aspects I was most curious about, and they did not disappoint. While Rebirth's boss battles don't feature the same level of spectacle found in Final Fantasy XVI's boss fights, let's be real, what game does? Rebirth's boss fights still offer more than enough spectacle of their own, seamlessly transitioning between spectacularly choreographed pre-rendered cutscenes into gameplay. A new addition to FF7 in Rebirth is the Item Transmuter, a device that allows you to take the resources you gather around Rebirth's world and craft them into healing items, new equipment for your party members, or even the occasional quest item. Though one very minor bone I have to pick with Rebirth comes in the form of its items, namely its potions. Potions feel borderline useless in Rebirth. Even at the very beginning of the game, the base potions do almost nothing, so it feels like high potions should have been the default. While this was never too much of a problem, as Rebirth is by no means a difficult game, and I primarily used magic for healing anyway, it's still an odd choice to make one of the most common healing items feel entirely redundant. While you primarily explore Rebirth's world as Cloud, there are points throughout the game where the party gets split up, which not only allows for unique pairings of characters to spend time together, but also gives opportunities to explore the world as each of the playable party members, all of whom have different abilities that allow them to navigate the world uniquely. Barrett can shoot his way through barriers that are blocking your way, Red 13 can run along walls, and Kate Sith can squeeze through vents, or hop on his Moogle to pick up and throw crates to solve some simple puzzles. And just like in combat, I was impressed by just how fun each character was to play while exploring the world of Rebirth. There are a couple of strange, gimmicky inclusions in Rebirth's exploration, but thankfully they never go on for more than a couple of minutes, so they don't hurt Rebirth's pacing in any significant way. They're just odd design choices. For instance, there are a couple of points early on where you're basically tasked with using a giant vacuum cleaner to suck up Mako energy, and I was worried that this would be a recurring mechanic to pad out the runtime, but it's only isolated to this specific section. Unlike Remake, which was overall a fairly linear game, Rebirth is filled with massive open areas that are packed with hundreds of side activities. The scope is mind-blowing. Rebirth isn't exactly an open world game, at least not in the traditional sense, as it doesn't have one big interconnected map. Instead, it consists of a series of sprawling regions that you fast travel between, but make no mistake, this game is huge. I have no idea how Creative Business Unit 1 were able to develop Rebirth in just over 4 years. I assume they must have had an enormous development staff, broken up into small groups that were each focused on different pockets of the game. You can see the influence Western RPGs have had on Rebirth while exploring its open areas. Rebirth's co-director Naoki Hamaguchi has cited The Witcher 3 and Gorilla's Horizon games as inspirations for Rebirth. And that certainly shines through, as does the influence of Ubisoft's open world games. You literally climb towers to reveal new points of interest in Rebirth. Though it's safe to say that the content found in Rebirth's open regions is of a much higher calibre of quality than the side content found in the majority of Ubisoft games. Don't get me wrong, I actually really do like Far Cry and Assassin's Creed, but I think we all know that going across those maps, ticking off all the little check marks, is mostly empty calories. While Rebirth offers a ton of side activities, they're highly varied, and I was surprised by how meaningful a lot of them felt, as they offer plenty of world building, and you're almost always rewarded with a substantial cutscene for completing all instances of any given activity. Because of this, I was clearing out every last icon on the map before moving on to the next area. Throughout Rebirth's open areas, you'll find life springs to scan that will give intel for each region, combat assignments where you'll fight region-specific enemies with bonus parameters, like staggering the opponents or not getting hit by specific attacks, to gather as much information as possible on these creatures, sanctuaries in which you can learn more about Rebirth's summons, and finding these will make the fights against these summons required to get their summoning materia much easier, which is essential as the base version of the summon fights are hard as nails. Moogle houses, where you'll need to round up a group of Moogles and chase them back home without getting hit by their magic abilities. And completing Moogle houses lets you buy items from their stores, though the Moogle houses are by far the most boring and repetitive activity found in Rebirth. Also, what the hell is going on with the Moogles in this game? Why do they look so weird? The Moogle designs might be my least favourite thing about Rebirth, but I think that just goes to show how amazing Rebirth is, that the Moogle designs are one of the only things I have to take umbrage with. Of course, the overly chatty robot Chadley is also back in Rebirth, with a myriad of new combat simulator missions. Completing these rewards you with points that you can exchange for new materia, and this is also where you'll fight the summons in challenging battles to get their summon materia. The fights in the battle simulator become more grueling as they progress, eventually hitting the point of being utterly brutal. Just look at how low the percentage of players who have managed to beat all of them is on PSN. Making these battles all the more punishing is the fact that you can't use items in the battle simulator, so you have to rely entirely on magic to strengthen and heal your party. And because you can't use items to restore their MP, once you've burnt through all of it, that's it. You're completely out of ways to heal and revive party members. I know a lot of people despised Chadley in Remake, and at the time, I didn't hate him as much as others, but I'm here to tell you, I was wrong about Chadley. Chadley is so much more annoying in Rebirth, as he's not only hanging around towns. Instead, he's constantly talking to you through a radio whenever you tackle side activities. And let me tell you, it took every ounce of strength in me to not just mash circle to skip his dialogue whenever he opened his mouth. Though admittedly, I would sometimes hit the DualSense's mute button when he was talking and just read the subtitles. By default, Chadley's voice comes through the DualSense's built-in speaker when he calls you, which makes him all the more grating. I know some people don't like the controller speaker, but I honestly don't mind it if it's used with restraint, so I usually just leave it on. But the sound of Chadley's voice constantly coming through that tinny-ass speaker quickly started to drive me nuts, and I had to shut it off. And we haven't even gotten to my favourite side activity in Rebirth yet. Queen's Blood, a deck building card game. Queen's Blood is all about placing cards with various strengths in 3 separate lanes. If you have more powerful cards than your opponent in a lane by the end of the game, the combined strength of your cards in that row will be added to your overall score. The cards you play also place counters that determine where you can place subsequent cards, as each card requires a specific amount of counters on a spot before it can be played. Rebirth's Queen's Blood matches start out very simple, and you'll likely breeze through all the matches you come across in the first few regions of Rebirth. But the further you get into the game, the more complex the games become, as you start dealing with players whose cards can debuff or destroy your cards, and matches where you're given a more restrictive starting point to place your initial cards. Card games are nothing new for Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VIII had Triple Triad, and FF9 had Tetramaster, but Queen's Blood is by far the best FF card game. In fact, Queen's Blood is probably my favourite game within a game ever, which I was not expecting, as with the exception of Balatro, which I've developed a borderline unhealthy obsession with, I'm not normally big on card games. I fully expected Queen's Blood to be something I would play one mandatory game of once, then never touch again. But instead, I was captivated by Queen's Blood and ecstatic to challenge each new player I stumbled across. The most pleasantly surprising aspect of Rebirth's side content is just how high quality its side missions are. Rebirth features some of the best side quests I've ever encountered in a game. Unlike Final Fantasy XVI, where most of the side missions are boring, by-the-numbers fodder, until you're finally given the good side missions in the very tail end of the game, Rebirth gives you meaningful, high-effort side missions from the jump. Many side missions pair Cloud with one other party member, allowing Square to further develop these characters. And by completing the side missions, you'll deepen your bond with the party member Cloud was partnered up with. You truly never know where the events of a side mission are going to take you, as you help the townspeople in each location you travel through. In one mission, you'll need to take photos of Red 13 against various backdrops to help inspire a novelist who's struggling with writer's block. In another, Cloud and Tifa are transformed into frogs after stumbling into a swamp filled with a mysterious pink fog. While one of my personal favourites saw me going on the best escort mission I've ever experienced in a game, as I accompanied a dog named Salmon from one village to another, while Salmon's earworm of a theme tune blasted the whole time. Some of Rebirth's side missions introduce recurring characters whose stories continue throughout the game across different continents, and you'll even encounter a handful of familiar faces from Remake in side quests. So many of Rebirth's side missions have been infused with a ton of love and care, so even if you're not planning to 100% Rebirth, I would implore you to check out all the side quests, because they truly help to build out the world and cast in meaningful ways. As we knew from Rebirth's trailers, you largely use chocobos to navigate Rebirth's vast open regions. Whenever you land in a new region, you'll have to wrangle yourself a new chocobo, because each region has unique, differently coloured chocobos, many of whom have specific abilities that they've developed to help them traverse the terrain of the environments they inhabit, like the strong-legged Junon chocobos that can scale walls, or the teal-coloured chocobos of Cosmo Canyon that can glide. I think chocobos have one of the best creature designs in gaming. There's something so cool about seeing your entire crew rolling around atop a herd of chocobos. I especially love seeing Red 13 on a chocobo. It's so dumb, it's incredible. Once again, I just love how unafraid Rebirth is to be silly. If you've been on the internet over the past couple of months, you've likely heard that Rebirth has tons of mini-games scattered across its world. And I mean tons. We're talking about a Yakuza level of mini-games in Rebirth. Throughout the open regions, you'll find mini-games like Auto Battle of Fort Condor, which makes its return after showing up in the Integrate DLC for Remake. But you'll find the densest concentration of mini-games around Costa del Sol, where you can try your hand at a shooting gallery, or play a 4-way game of soccer against various animals as Red 13, and of course, the Gold Saucer, the iconic theme park from the original FF7, which Rebirth offers an extraordinary reimagining of, full of sights to see and mini-games to play. Rebirth fully delivers on the promise of the Gold Saucer, truly making it into the magical wonderland it always was in our minds when we were filling in the blanks of the PS1 iteration. There's so much to do in the Gold Saucer, it's ridiculous. There's 3D Brawler where you play Rock'em Sock'em Robot style fights as the blocky Cloud from the original version of FF7, G-Bike where you can relive the motorcycle sequences from Remake, a space shooter, a coliseum full of fights, and my personal favourite, Chocobo Racing, which is a surprisingly competent arcade racer, arguably more so than the standalone FF kart racer, Chocobo GP. I was blown away by how fleshed out some of these mini-games are. Chocobo Racing alone has 20 tracks, multiple playable chocobo, and dozens of pieces of gear to customise your chocobo's appearance and stats. I loved my visit to the Gold Saucer in Rebirth. I think this entire sequence is a beautiful encapsulation of the magic of this Rebirth trilogy, and I would have been more than satiated with my first visit there. But the Gold Saucer held one more surprise for me. When you go back later on, they add even more to do. Once again, I'm just stunned by the obscene amount of content Square was able to cram into Rebirth during its relatively short development time. By the time I'd finished Rebirth, my in-game clock was at 104 hours, and I had done nearly everything. I fully cleared out the map, completed every side mission, won every match of Queen's Blood, got all the summon materia, and got the highest grading in each minigame. The only thing I didn't finish was Chadley's combat simulations, and I loved every second I spent with Rebirth. Do you know how good a game has to be for you to put 100 hours into it and still feel like you'd play more? Few games can justify this kind of runtime. Hell, most open world games struggle to justify a runtime of half this length. More on that in my next review. But Rebirth never left me fatigued by its length, and I'm someone who argues that most games should be shorter. Developers often overshoot how long their games are. When they say their game is 10 hours long, it's more often 6 to 8. When they say 20, it's usually 12 to 15. Rebirth is the anomaly where the developers might have undershot the length of their game. Square had said it would take 100 hours to do everything in Rebirth, but it's almost certainly going to take you much longer if you want to make your way through all the combat simulator challenges. And if you're aiming for the platinum in Rebirth, you're probably looking at least 150 hours, as it also requires a second playthrough on the hard difficulty that's unlocked after you finish Rebirth. If you're even remotely familiar with Final Fantasy, you no doubt know that the series is home to some of the best music in gaming. While the music in a Final Fantasy game is almost always of unparalleled quality, VII's soundtrack has always been among the finest in the series, and Rebirth's take on this music is unbelievably good. Both the new and old tracks featured in Rebirth are spectacular. The recreations of Final Fantasy VII's character themes are beautiful. Tifa and Aerith's themes are two of the most powerful and instantly recognisable character themes in any medium. It's impossible not to be filled with an overwhelming sense of nostalgia whenever one of these tracks kicks in, and One Winged Angel may very well be the best piece of music ever composed for a game. No matter how many times I've heard it in these games, it never fails to give me chills, and Rebirth's stunning rendition is used to masterful effect. While at times Final Fantasy VII can look very pretty, it isn't the best looking game on PS5, and it's not as visually impressive as Final Fantasy XVI or even the PS5 version of Final Fantasy VII Remake. There are some flat textures, and character models look better in some instances than others, but this is obviously because Rebirth is a far bigger, more open and content-rich game than Remake or 16, so Creative Business Unit 1 has had to allocate resources differently. They've also prioritised other aspects of the game this time around. Rebirth's physics, for instance, are far more robust than either 16 or Remake's, with tons of the furniture and miscellaneous objects in the world responding when you bump into them, which did lead to a hilarious moment when an NPC just barreled through and knocked over a bunch of chairs in the middle of a cutscene. I played the entirety of Rebirth in performance mode, and the game does take a substantial visual hit when playing in performance mode, with objects in the distance looking pixelated. Though it is worth noting that while I was playing Rebirth, Square did drop a patch that added the sharp performance mode, which does substantially improve the visual fidelity of performance mode, removing much of the blurriness that I'd noticed prior to the patch. While it still doesn't look anywhere near as good as graphics mode, performance mode nearly always runs at a silky smooth 60 FPS, so I'm more than happy to take a dip in visual fidelity for sturdy performance, as frame rate is far more important than graphics to me. Rebirth was also a largely very polished experience for me. I had a couple of moments in cutscenes where a texture on someone's clothing wouldn't load incorrectly, but I never encountered anything remotely game-breaking. I did have one false alarm near the end of Rebirth, where the final side mission glitched out on me, and I thought I was going to be locked out of the trophy for completing every side mission. But just when I'd given up hope and accepted that I was just going to have to finish the game and move on, I saw a notification pop up that a new update had been installed. After this, I went back and retried the final side quest, and thankfully, the patch had fixed the bug, and I was able to complete the mission and get my precious trophy. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a tour de force. Rebirth wonderfully builds upon the foundations laid by Remake by providing even more depth and charm to Final Fantasy VII's extraordinary cast of characters, massively expanding the scope of the story, and further refining the already phenomenal combat system. Rebirth is destined to go down as one of the greatest RPGs of this generation, and I will be flabbergasted if it isn't my game of the year for 2024 when all is said and done. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. You can find countless other videos on my channel, including my recent reviews of Persona 3 Reload and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. And be sure to stay tuned for my upcoming reviews of Rise of the Ronin and Stellar Blade.